My name is Thomas. I will be presenting the test automation Firehose, be strategic and tactical today. I also hope that you do not mind the theme of the presentation. I recently had to give a talk in a movie theater before Infinity Wars, and so I themed it then, and all the work went into this, so I decided I want to reuse it again for another automation talk. So just be forewarned, you will be getting mini animations involving Marvel superheroes and villains. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experience with automating 73 applications at my company and the trouble that I ran into in many of those situations and the places where I did have some successes. To do so, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, as well as origin story with regarding automation testing tools and frameworks, the approaches that you would want to take to automate both strategically and tactically, the framework and tools that are available to you, and just one in particular I'll demonstrate, as well as some of the common challenges you would face overcoming these hurdles to the strategic automation team, not just tactical, as well as ways in which you can schedule formalized activities and make them part of your software development lifecycle. And lastly, the quality standards that you want to put in place so that way your automation is both maintainable and extensible for the long term. And lastly, I have the metrics, which in some cases it should be traditionally an upfront in this style of presentation. However, I'll save these for last because you all really want to look through a lot of equations and graphs and charts. I'll save that for the end in case we run into lunch, and I'll of course make this presentation available to anyone who wants to see thereafter. So a little bit about myself. I'm a senior application architect for Huntington National Bank. We're headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. I've been with the company for about 4 years. Before I was in IT, I was a research scientist for about 12 years, studying fluorescence microscopy and spectroscopy. That little guy's GFP, or green fluorescent protein, that I use as a tag. I also worked as a baker for about 5 years, crossing over between my time in science and IT. I worked for Panera Bread. If you ever go into one of their bakeries in the morning, you'll see the bread wall, including all the sweets that they have. It's typically made by one person. It's still my favorite job. I gave it up when I got married. I'm also a gigantic geek. I love playing board games. I have over 1,600, and I travel around the world to play a game called Diplomacy. It's a game of negotiation where there's no limits placed on what you can say to the other players, which is why I have to travel around the world, because it's tough to find 7 people wanting to get together where you can lie to them. I'm also a huge evangelist for Ruby, Cucumber, and just automation in particular. I love training, and I love talking about automation. So a little bit of background about automation, in particular, the difference between strategy and tactics. And this, for me, goes back into gaming, and other people goes back into military history, where your strategy is really your plan of action for your deliverables to get about in terms of what you're planning to do for your project, the resources that you're going to need. And by resources, I mean actual tools. I don't mean people. When I talk about people, I'll say people and not resources. And tactics, the way in which you're actually going to deliver that actual plan. When we say the difference between strategy and tactics, a lot of people, when they go into driving through the given project, whether it's development or testing, we think about it tactically. It's like, I just need to get done with this next task. It doesn't matter how it's done. In fact, many methodologies or frameworks will say we don't care how you do it, so long as it is done, it meets our definition of done. But it does matter about reflection with regards to how you're approaching the work and how it will handle a year from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now. So these are some considerations that we want to make. Let's go through with a brief example here with Microsoft. So Microsoft has a huge testing challenge, and they had one. This is from 2004. When they ever wanted to test a combination of their operating system server with IE, they had to test all of these variables that they would hold, the different versions of IE and the Windows version. Well, that's also a consideration that they make is, well, not all versions of it run the same version of IE, as well as they have to consider all of the different language binaries, of which there are 26 for the IE version to test. Adding, well, multiplying those up, you end up with about 326 combinations that they would have to test, which is an impossibility unless you have a huge team. So instead, what they had to do was take an approach of looking at how you can identify what we refer to now as personas, sort of buckets of common testing that you can have. I believe we have Alan here, who worked through Microsoft for around 22 years, so I think he could provide some better insight than myself rather than a blog post on this. But the combinations they had to test was immense and really impossible for a small team. And so you had to take a strategic approach in identifying these personas and saying, all right, this is good enough. This is a risk-based approach that we had to testing. We have to take that same approach for test automation, especially in the digital world, where you have to make considerations for the fractured device market for both mobile and web, of the different operating system, browser combinations, screen resolution sizes, devices that you're working on. If you try to get anywhere close to 90% of your user base, really is impossible at a given scale, because there are just too many combinations for you to go through, especially to test that manually. And even with automation, there's going to be a lot of reports to review, and there may just not be enough time. So again, you have to take a risk-based approach to that testing. So the automation tools have been seen as a sort of a silver bullet, or at least presented as such for people, especially who are working on commercial-based tools, that, hey, you can use this and it's going to solve all your problems. Manual testing somehow became a dirty word, even though for me it's still the most core and important component, exploratory testing especially, with relations to quality control. The tools that have evolved over the years have taken on more of a guise of, we're now moving to an artificial intelligence and machine learning world, where we went from some traditional GUI-based tools that are looking for just simply point and clicking to direct API interaction. Really the core, like if it's not broke, you don't need to fix it. Using just shell scripting, it will always work. But most of the tools we have now are similar to upgrading versions of Iron Man, where we're going to higher and higher production values. And now you have, with IBM, Blue Prism, you have Maple, and all of these tools that promise the world and say it's going to solve all your testing problems are similar to the Justice League movie. Really high in production values, but ends up being oftentimes low on content. So the approach that we have to take as an organization or as a testing team is, what is the best fit in terms of the tool for the job that we want to use? I'm just curious here, just polling the audience, since we have people from literally all over the world, can someone offer up any of the challenges they've encountered in supporting automation as, say, an analyst or a tester or a stakeholder or a friendly neighborhood web developer?
One of my biggest challenges right now, which you touched on earlier, is I have 3 QA members in a team, and one of them is full automation, one of them is about 60-40, and the other one is manual. But the manual one complains that the 100% automation person should be automating everything. So I kind of have to teach her that that's not how we work. Like it's about happy path, critical path, making sure that the product actually works for the customer. We automate those things first, and then any edge case scenarios we can automate in the future, or when we have time, we do that. So I'm trying to find out what the middle ground is, because this person's very talented and they're moving at a fast pace. So I'm trying to find out what the middle ground is between, now he's trying to getting into this mindset of, well, maybe I should automate everything, but I don't want him to.
Working especially with what you consider to be split teams, where there's a few segments that I engage with that they have separated out. These are people that they're going to work on automation 100% of the time. These individuals, they're going to be more exploratory, as well as handle a lot of the project level admin tasks, the meetings and such. And it ends up being a bit of a disconnect between the two if you have people separate those roles, but also how do you overcome what you consider to be the sort of technology hurdle in, do you want to uplift certain people and have them focus on this as a path, or is it something that's going to just be occasional? Anyone else want to share? Don't worry, I won't force you to. I mean, no matter the approach that we take, the ultimate goal that we have when we're trying to bring across test automation, to distill it into three primary categories, is, well, we want better coverage, we want to make better progress with our project, and we want to improve quality. Whether this actually happens or not, we've seen many cases where it's failed and fall flat on its face. But what we want to do is look at all those individual instances in which it failed and see, can we bring about positive change? Can we take an appropriate strategy that will help us to implement a long-term solution with automation? And this is overall, I'm not going to cover each one of these areas in depth because it would be impossible in a 45-minute time span for the strategies that you want to take. There's also a number of great texts available on the subject matter, from implementing automated software testing by Alfredi Dustin to experiences in test automation, of which I think Alan has got a chapter in that about his history at Microsoft. But overall, when we look at the strategies, we want to say, well, what is the scope that we're taking as an upfront approach to our automation? What are going to be some of the objectives, some measurable outcome? Because we can't just say we're going to automate. We have to have some measurement around that. What is going to be the team approach within your day-to-day work planning? As well as what are the framework and tools that you're going to use? What are ways in which you're going to show that, yes, we have met our goals, we haven't? The scheduling of it, is it going to be delayed behind development, or is it going to be concurrent with development, or are you going to try to work ahead? As well as the constant challenge of the technical skill set. If you have people in place that don't write automation, what do you do with them? Do you train them what they consider to be uplift? Do you replace those people? Do you outsource your automation to a separate company? You know, these are all challenges that you have to address when considering the overall strategy for your automation. Well, let's first look at the approach that you'd want to take. So I decided to change because we've all seen the test automation pyramid from Mike Kahn, and I follow Alan on Twitter, and so I saw recently that there was a discussion, as close as you can call that, on Twitter. Mostly it's people yelling back and forth each other about the usage and focus of UI test automation. And the source behind that is people overly focus on UI test automation compared to your integration or service layer, and especially your unit tests. And the approach that Alan proposes instead of the pyramid is using an automation snowman, where the size of the circle really relates to duration is what you're looking for. And so tests that run very quickly, and you want to organize them in that manner of, if they run very quickly, these are the larger circles and ones that you want to focus on. So unit tests run very quickly, on the order of hundreds of seconds, and they can allow you to have that laser focus down into what is the source of the bug or defect that you have. And so most tests that you want to have for automation are going to be on the unit test level. Next farther up is the integration level, whether it's your integration test, your service calls that you're making. Those run much more quickly. They're focused on individual interfaces and modules that you can test more easily, and they're much more robust. And so you'd want to use those over the UI-based automation, which oftentimes can be very flaky. You'll have flickering tests, especially with the end-to-end tests that go over multiple application types. So what you want to do is take the approach of, let's first focus on unit tests. So that means involving the developers and including those standards in your build pipeline, as well as adding an integration test. This is something that can be worked on from both ends, either from the development tools that are available or some of the testing tools that you can use. And then lastly, we wanted to start with, say, the happy paths that you're going to do for your UI-based flows, the ones that are based upon your user behaviors. So at least you'll have all of your bases covered. So what should we automate? that's a question that's always asked when you're going through your tasking session or you're going through backlog refinement. So it's good practice to have a sort of checklist available to you to determine feasibility for that automation. One is this something that's going to be repeated many times over? Is this something that is going to take a lot of time or is prone to human error? Is this something that requires test data setup and management or environment setup? These are the things that you want to enable your testers to have to go in with this sort of checklist so that way they can upfront make a determination. But if you're working more in a waterfall world where you're going through your scope and estimation session, then perhaps you have someone who's your test lead or maybe your test architect who has that information, is looking at these projects from an upfront to say, these areas are good candidates for us to approach automation versus this should take more of a manual approach, and let that drive the allocation of hours. One core component that people often overlook with automation is the costs. So with automation, you have the same costs that you have with any development code base. It is code. Your application's purpose is to test another application, so you should consider it as such. So whether you're working on things that have commercial tools that you have to pay yearly upkeeps on, or you have to go through upgrades, or you're using open source tools where you still have to make considerations for upgrades of languages, for operating systems, as well as any maintenance that occurs. Very few people can actually put automation tests into their suite or into the tool that's given and have zero upkeep that's involved with those tests in the future. At a certain point, you have to go back to them and make changes if either your application is changing, which will require those tests to change, or you have data or environment concerns. There are upkeep costs associated with your automation that you have to take into account when looking at the overall return on investment. So it's important to put these up front because these need to be built into your estimates for time. If you do not, then you're going to find that you'll have some runaway upkeep costs that will make them less valuable in the long term over what you expected. If you have this going into your mind up front, then you can make certain accommodations for the changes you're going to have to do and also the implementation with regards to the framework that you have. So here's a for instance. If we want to look at the different way in which we have constraints within an organization, this applies to just testing period. We have concerns about what is the budget for that project, what is the delivery date that we have. Even if we say, hey, we could possibly deliver this increment this month, the upper management has other ideas about when things should go in. So we're always limited, especially in the testing space, where often development bleeds over and eats up hours that we would otherwise have. So in the same way you have a checklist of, is this feasible? What you also want to do is make a consideration is, if it is feasible, then should we actually carry through with the automation? And that's where you look at what is the criticality of that feature that you want to develop or the frequency with which it's being used, as well as do you have any sort of legal compliance concerns? So I work for a financial institution, and so we have a number of these where we should absolutely have automation tests around them to make sure we do not break the law. As well as, do you have any data and environment issues? If you know it requires a great deal of test data creation or manipulation, then that's something you want to target for automation because the cost of going in the activities around actually testing are greater than the actual testing themselves. And so not just test, but also task automation as well. And you want to also look at what is the availability for reuse. If this is going to be something you do upfront that's going to be used by other scripts later on down the line, then that could be something that you target for automation. For instance, we're going to say login as a feature is going to have a great deal of reuse because this is the entry path for this application. If every script and every test case that we have to use goes through the login, that's high reusability. So we want to make sure that that script is ready to go and it can be leveraged by other scripts that we have. And you just make this determination, project to project basis, feature to feature basis, If you're working on building out your application's core regression to begin with, before even any project, then you want to have a breakdown based upon feature so you can make this determination. Works similar to product backlog refinement, where you're going to try to put the highest priority items at the top and work on those first. Overall, with good test automation, and this is something that is important to bring up to the management, it's just a tool. It's not intended to replace people. And you should not get into the discussion about reducing headcount if you're bringing in automation. I've had this conversation many times with many different segment CIOs that believe that, all right, what can I reduce the headcount by? How many hours are you saving me so I can cut down either offshore or I can cut down on site? It's not the intended purpose of automation. These are checks that we're introducing so that our people can take on more valuable tasks. It's just one end of the spectrum where it's in the scripted area. We want the scripts to be handled by automation so that way the people can be freed up to do exploratory testing and other more valuable tasks. So in this way, if you're trying to approach automation, don't look at it as the either time sink that you're going to just only do automation and only write these scripts, or as a means through which you can cut down on your QA organization. You need to look at them as a tool that is going to help out your testers and eliminate those redundant, repetitive tasks so that way they can do things that are more valuable. So this is a brief look at framework and tools. Again, there are dozens upon dozens of tools that could be used. If you want to learn more, I recommend checking out Joe Colantonio's site as well as his podcast that he frequently posts top 50 lists, top 20 lists for the different tools that are available. So the one that I'm just going to show here that we use is Ruby Cucumber with Selenium. This is just from the UI-based component. The reason why we have decided on this tool for our UI tests is because we want to share that top-level language, the gherkin, with our stakeholders and other members of the team, so that way we have a domain-specific language that everyone can understand. And we've taken this a step further where our requirements analysts or BSAs are writing their requirements in gherkin format in a standardized way, so that way we can have some initial immediate tests that are matching the business logic that we have based upon the user experience. This reduces the amount of rewrite that has to occur from here's my requirements to let me write in these test cases, or here's my interpretation based upon what the developer thinks the requirements analyst meant. In this way, we tried to reduce the amount of rework that had to be done from requirements to developer and tester, eliminate that telephone game. It works for us for a number of teams. In other instances, it may not work depending upon your circumstance. I just wanted to bring this up here. I'm not saying for any one given framework that we have here that this is the absolute way to do it. A lot of people try to say that my way is the absolute way. This is just one way that it works. We use underneath the cover Selenium. The reason why we use that for our UI-based test is the broad support as an open source tool. It can work in many different languages. Again, the reason why we chose Ruby is it's a more accessible programming language that if you're going to train people, one, the primarily the best one is shell scripting, but with Ruby you have a language that is very close to plain English as well, so it's accessible for people to learn, and it gives us the ability in this case of also testing across browsers for our digital applications, our customer-facing applications. So for those various combinations that we're required to test, we can hit all the various browsers and the operating systems that we need and the devices that we need. However, for the standards that we're going to use, we need to take into account of rampant growth. My prior company is a Fortune 100 company that sells insurance, also located in Columbus, Ohio. They may be on your side. Each single team working in that organization had their own automation setup, their own automation framework. So every implementation that you look through was different set of libraries used, different set of standards that they had. And this was across dozens and dozens of teams. And it became incredibly difficult to, one, go into a team and figure out what exactly they're doing. Two, it became difficult to enforce any sort of generalized standards for them. And three, Because people would come and go as you would in IT, move from different organizations or teams, you would reach such a point that it was built on a shaky foundation and people would just wholesale throw away the old suite and build up a new one. So all those years of work would just be tossed out. So one of the changes I made with my new company is we use a lot of reusable steps for Ruby. That is to say, for common user actions that we looked at, for instance, clicking on an object, navigating to a page, or if you're going to database, having a query, or the mainframe interacting with the screen in a certain way, we tried to define with our requirements analyst central user actions that you can take based upon application type. And we came up with 40-some steps for web, around 50-some for mobile, around 20-some that we could go with mainframe. And with those central user actions, that's the way we write our requirements to, is we go based upon those central user actions. These are written in a very imperative style. We also have declaratives over top of it. But making these reusable, the purpose of it was to reduce the need to go into the support code and make changes underneath the covers. If we can limit down our testers to such a point where they're worried about writing that high-level gherkin, they're identifying the objects that they want to interact with, which is also very formulaic, as well as addressing any data, then that's less time that they need to write test automation code. They're going right to the test and having it execute, so then they can go into more valuable tasks. Again, this is just one way to implement, and the reason why we chose this way is, one is we didn't want to have rampant growth where we'd have to throw stuff away, and two, when I came into my company, there's zero automation. There was no coders from the QA space as well. And so all the individuals had to be converted over to automation QA analysts, and we had to do so in such a way that did not impact project delivery times. Oh, very easy. Just take a few dozen people, train them without impacting any of their project work. No big deal. And so that's why I had to go with this means of, all right, we're going to teach them how to code without having to actually code, sort of a code Lego. And we found that it was very successful, and then expanded that to various lines and different application types. But that's just the top level. What is the most important one are the unit and integration test level. And there are many tools available, whether they're independent of whatever language you're using, but the challenge that you're going to face here is we are in the QA space. We have some direct control over the way all of our testers and fellow QA managers conduct themselves with regards to a project. However, we have less control over developers, especially developers who don't want to write unit tests. In the prior session that we had, one individual mentioned that they had a requirement of 65 to 95 or somewhere around that % unit tests that need to be committed by the developers, otherwise their commit will get rejected. And it's great to have those standards, but what I found in many cases, this is at both the organizations I was at, that there are no such standards. Instead it'd say, we would like you to do this. However, if you get close to the deadline, it's okay if you don't, as long as it's done. How do we address this? Well, one is, it definitely needs to be built into your SDLC, as this is part of your definition of done, of having these unit tests and having the integration tests. Also having some way in which you can actually accept or reject a developer's work based upon that into your CI/CD pipeline is important. I can speak again to my experiences. There are no such strict requirements at present in my organization. However, the chief architect is on board with making this change this year, in that we have to have complete code coverage, so we have to have all the unit tests. So instead of certain devs who have good practices, other ones they don't, we can now add in that coverage, because otherwise you end up having to write UI-based tests that are doing the same thing as unit tests. They're just much more slow and much more flaky. Challenges that you have to face when introducing automation strategically and tactically. One of those is what I referred to in the title of this is the Firehose. So in the Firehose, you have people who you've just taught automation, or people you brought in who are automation engineers, and they're like, I'm gonna automate everything. There's a meme out there, it's like, automate all the things. Absolutely not. We have Hulk to help us out. Hulk, what's the way we should do it? Well, just because you can automate something doesn't mean that you should. So you should use those guidelines that I provided about, one, is it feasible? Once you decide, yes, it is feasible, then two, look at, should we do it based upon the budget, timeline, and the criticality of the features that we're working on. So this way, you want to maintain that Snowman, where the smallest head component of the Snowman, the UI tests are the least amount of tests that you have. These are the core tests where you start with the happy path, or the functionality that matches the user behavior. So this way, you're not automating everything, because every time you have to automate something, again, we go back to, that is a maintenance cost that you're going to incur from that point on to maintain that test for as long as it exists. You want to keep those maintenance costs low. Another area where we have common issues with people automating tactically rather than strategically is data failure. Is they say, all right, I'm going to write an automation test, and it's going to work in this one environment because I know the test data is there. But what happens when you go up to higher environments or into production? What happens if you have needs of data generation, or you are, as a result of your test, generating data but not doing any cleanup? You have some very selfish data going on. Well, you're causing issues with your long-term viability of your automation suite. That's right, how dare you block this on emoji, hello. Instead, the approach that you want to take is an upfront concern. This is part of your entry criteria for the team space. And what I mean by that is if you're waterfall in your scope and estimation, you set up these as specific requests of you need data populated in each of the environments or control over the data so you can create and manipulate it. In the same way, if you're working on backlog refinement, this would be in your definition of ready for new cards. We've all worked on projects in which we had no data, nor did we have mocking for the data, and so we had to hope that things would work, and we would set those cards to done even though they were not really done, and then later we'd find out there'd be an issue in a higher environment. Or we had outside dependencies where we had other teams that we were relying on that data, and we would still continue work, and we'd hope that we'd actually get it at some point so we could test it. Instead, the approach you should take is make it a requirement up front before the team begins work on it. Otherwise, you reject that work entering the team space. This is a long-term benefit. Another area where you have common concerns with automating tactically rather than strategically are those flickering tests. So you've got lots of tests on there. You don't care if the old ones are flickering. You just care about the new ones because you're getting done with your work. But those old tests that are going green to red, or ones that are constantly staying red, is actually hurting you. The reason why it's hurting you is because you're reducing the credibility of your tests. If half of your suite is red, or a quarter of your suite is red, and the email notifications that you receive, or the developers receive, or other stakeholders receive are the same of, hey, a lot of our stuff is failing, then people stop to care about the results of your automation because they can't trust it anymore. You need to make sure that your automation tests are passing consistently with a high degree of accuracy. So that way, when you do see failures, those checks that you have running will raise alarms for the stakeholders as well as members of the team. If there are flickering tests, either fix them or get rid of them. Because a test that is flickering, a false positive, is going to waste your time if you have to go investigate and doing a failure analysis results in, hey, everything's working, it's just the automation code. When you are looking at failures, you want to make sure to identify it as this is a true bug/defect with your application, or this is an issue with the data that's outside our control, or this is an issue with the environment that's outside our control. If you have issues that you trace back to strictly your scripting, then that's the opportunity you take to look at how did we get to this point? How can we ensure that this test will no longer flicker, or let's remove this test and it should be manual again. So at least when we're testing it manually, we're absolutely sure about its viability. Another area where you have an issue is long tests. And in some instances, this is unavoidable. I'll give for example, with the applications I support, one of which is mortgage loan origination. So if you're getting a mortgage for your house or taking out a loan for a car, RV, or boat, we've all likely gone through one of those 4 processes, and it is a long one. Lots of data entry for yourself. Not as a tester, I'm talking about as a customer. It takes a long time. From the project team standpoint, that's a lot of business rules as well, because they have to make a consideration for people's income, where they live, what their credit score is, what are the laws around the loans that they can give them. These are a lot of business rules, a lot of them that are intertangled for processes that are very long, that take hours to fill out just by yourself manually. And this results in, if you're going to automate it from a UI perspective, it's a really long, hours-long test. API can be much quicker. And so what you should instead do with these long tests is restrict it down to just a few that you have that are going to be interacting with the UI, these so-called happy path or a few unhappy path tests. The rest of it that you should take should be focused on the API level, the service level, so that way you can quickly iterate over all of those combinations and get your results back in minutes as opposed to days. For instance, one of the tests that I had here takes a little over 4 hours to run, to go through, and it's just a happy path. So developers who submit their code, if they submit it after noon, we're not going to get an answer on whether things worked out or not until after they've left for the day. Anytime that you're reducing the ability for you to give feedback in a timely manner, you are reducing the viability of your automation. What you want to target is giving it back feedback as soon as possible with an accuracy that the developers will trust. The other way that is, go ahead.
I was just going to ask a question on that. So have you ever put in as criteria duration and time? We've been somewhat successful with anything like with our first priority tests taking no more than like we went sub 5 minutes, right? So upon check-in, we want this suite of tests. Have you put in any criteria where there's actually a time boxed or duration maximum as part of that criteria, or have you seen or heard of success in that as well?
So we've worked with, my team is separate from DevOps. We're working with DevOps, so we put in requirements around the unit test, integration test, and then the UI test, which is the last component of their build pipeline. And so these, which are commonly called smoke tests, we put a time constraint around it. Even though teams say, hey, we think that these 20 tests are smoke tests, these are UI-based ones. No, we've set on a strict time deadline to get that response. And if they have these other tests, we have specific servers for them to execute daily, hourly, so that way they can get that feedback loop. But as part of the build pipeline, yes, we absolutely set up strict time deadlines for it to get that feedback to continue on. Because otherwise,
Sure.
you wait too long and then you're just not going to get that feedback and people will move on to something else. All right, another area that I brought up before is that shaky foundation. Is every time you get a new story or a new feature, then you build out a lot of custom functionality just to solve the problem. The sort of the get it done mentality that we have with the developers as well. That as long as it's done and it passes in this environment, then I'm good to go. That aggregates into a huge framework that you don't understand what half of it does. And eventually it becomes so entangled that you just decide you're going to have to throw it away. So instead, what you want to do is implement the same standards that you would expect if you had an ideal state for developer practices, such as using OOP principles of don't repeat yourself or keep it simple, stupid. And you want to have scheduled time for code reviews and code analytics running and refactoring sessions. You want to keep this as you would keep your house clean with your automation code. And you have actually greater control over this than developers do over their actual application code, because a lot of people aren't looking into seeing what you're doing, which is why you have such a shaky foundation to begin with, but also gives you that power to bring about these review structures such that you can ensure that long term you have a good application health. The last area where you run into these issues are where you're lagging behind the development. So this often happens where maybe you're a sprint or an iteration behind the developers with testing because you're waiting for it to go in a low environment for you to actually run the test scripts. Well, the way in which we want to address that is, as part of our definition of ready, of entering into the team space, what we want to do is we want to make sure that regardless of how many meetings people have, regardless of what we say is our ready and done, we want to make sure to update our ready state and done state criteria, that we have to have our unit test, our integration tests, and our automation tests done and passing in an environment before we say that story or that work is done. Otherwise, we reject that work as being ready to go, because otherwise you end up rolling up a lot of development work and automation work that is lagging behind. And no developer likes to go back and look a month or two in behind where they had some task they took on and say, oh, now there's a defect here and I have to go do costly rework. It's better to reject that from being done within the team up front, so that way you address it there and you reduce that amount of rework. Next, we talk about this sort of scheduling that occurs, whether I've got two here, one for Agile, one for Waterfall. When you're looking about integration into the team space, this is an upfront concern with automation. This is not QA that is going a sprint behind the development work. Is up front, you're identifying those candidates in the tasking session where you're pulling down story cards, going through backlog refinement. You're writing up your test cases at that point in time. The developers are required to write their unit tests as they're developing out their work. And you're required to have them passing at least in one environment before you set that for a done criteria. Doing it this way will roll up your project level automation that can then become part of your regression later on. In a similar vein with Waterfall, and many of us sort of exist on this sort of spectrum between Agile and Waterfall, you want to identify in your design phase as an upfront of these are what we consider to be viable for automation. Not just tests, but also tasks, the data generation manipulation, the environment setup. These are things that we can automate up front that will reduce the load on developers as well as testers. And during that implementation phase, that's where testing is also taking place, of writing those automation scripts from the UI or the integration level. And then you're executing everything you need in your verification phase. And then as you migrate up through multiple environments, you can execute those tests again and again and again. One way in which I recommend adding automation in as an upfront and identifying what are the unit tests we should be writing, what are the integration tests we should be writing, as well as what are the end-to-end flows, is using example mapping. By example mapping, this was introduced by Matt Wynn, who's one of the co-creators of Cucumber. He described it as you have these rules that are going to set up your core application behavior. This is your business logic. You're going to have questions in an example mapping session that are generated by what you consider to be traditionally three amigos that no one in the room can answer, as well as new user stories that are being created when a user story that you encounter is too large. Visually, it looks like this, where your user story is at the top in the yellow card. Underneath it are your business rules or your business logic. For each business rule that you have, you want to try to have one or more example, as well as, on any red cards, questions that no one in the room can answer. These are questions that go back to your stakeholders or other technical resources to help elaborate the story itself. So why is this important, and how does this apply to automation? Well, if we just take a single user story or feature that we have to work on, and we have identified that business logic, we have a good idea for each one of these blue cards that it's likely going to be an integration test, or at the very least multiple unit tests that we have around it. And for each of those examples, we can then identify specifically UI-based tests and minimize those, such that for every business rule that we have one UI test. We don't necessarily need to go beyond that, have multiple, so this way we minimize the amount of UI tests that we have. We can make sure that on multiple areas, we're addressing our application's functionality. The questions are also vital in this, as separate from automation, just purely for giving your team the opportunity to reject work from entering a team space that isn't actually ready to begin. And then lastly, the time box. Since we're tracked with everything we do, it's important to have this session that lasts, say, 30 minutes or less, and this way you know you're ready to begin work on it, or no, it needs to go back and needs further elaboration. So the feedback that you get from this is simply, if you have a lot of red cards, then that tells you got a lot of questions about the story and you're not ready to begin. If you have a lot of blue cards, then that's an indication that your user story is too big and you need to split it up. If you have a lot of green cards, that's an indication that the business rule that you have for there is too big and you need to split it up. This will help you identify those individual test cases and the business logic that you need to use. So the benefits from it is you get your UI tests and you get to minimize that, the sort of minimal viable product for the UI test, to make sure they don't grow unchecked. such that for each piece of business logic you have, you've got one UI test. For all of your business rules, you can then take it back as a developer and identify, here are the unit tests, and here are the integration tests that I need to write. So that way I've got good test coverage. And then from all of those red cards you have, the business analyst can take them back and ask the stakeholders, all right, this is what's needed to reduce the amount of rework that we possibly have. So here's an example map to get meta for scheduling a workshop, where my business rules are, hey, a room must be available, or the workshop has to occur within normal working hours, or we have to have enough people to actually conduct that workshop, where examples underneath them can range from, it has to, bare minimum, earliest begin at 8 a.m., end by 5 p.m. Or if we've got fewer than 4 people, maybe we can get by with not even renting a room and just go down to the lobby and run this workshop. Or if we have sufficient number of people, we actually have to have a room. Some of the questions we may have is, what if one or more of the trainers isn't available? Can we still conduct the workshop? Is catering required? Here we have catering, good job. Or what are some of the other requirements that I may have? The last component of the presentation, because I'll leave off metrics for later for people who want, are quality standards that we have. One of those ways in which we can ensure that automation is effective is with a regression review. So at the end of every release that you have, your test lead is going to compile all of those scripts that are associated with that release, as well as what you have as your existing regression. Your business analyst is going to provide us metrics on the application based upon what are the most used parts of the application we've seen post-release, what are the critical areas that we care about. We get the same thing from the product support, where they're going to provide us with information about where were the greatest number of incidents that we had, where did they occur within our application for that release in any prior period. And then your app manager is going to provide a list of your upcoming projects. So in this regression review, you're going to take a look at what are your new scripts, and you're going to identify which of those scripts that you've written up should belong as part of your core regression, and which part of your core regression should you just eliminate, period. And this way, you get all of those key stakeholders that care about the application involved in quality. The automation component of this is important in that you're going to have a focused regression run and a focused release run, but getting everyone talking about quality will ensure that we are running the tests that we actually care about. In the same way, you should also conduct code reviews and refactoring. So for your automation suite, you should ensure that on a regular basis, for every single piece of work that you are committing to it, that you should do a code review. You want to identify standards that you're going to use and implement throughout, and have a peer or a senior person conduct a code review for each piece of work that you have. This is a way to ensure long-term sustainability of your automation suite, as well as making sure it's most accurate and up-to-date. Refactoring is another core component of it. If we care about maintainability, extensibility, and domain knowledge, we conduct refactoring sessions on a regular basis, say a weekly basis. For a lot of the teams we have, we conduct them bi-weekly. We're requiring all members of the QA team for that application be present, where you're going through and pulling a random feature or underlying code or data, and you're refactoring it. So you're cleaning it up, maintaining the same functionality, just making sure it's more readable. This is very helpful for people who are not testing certain areas at the time. It gives them that open window into other domain knowledge about their application that they would otherwise not have. So in this way, we're expanding our knowledge, but also maintaining quality in our suite. And the way in which we actually implement this is we identify a team leader for each of those refactoring sessions, where they're going to look on based upon the scheduling that they have, that they're going to make sure to put it on the calendar. They're going to delegate any work that needs to be done, choose a focus area. We're going to have an automation person, someone who's an expert, sit in as a representative to make sure in case they encounter any technical hurdles that someone will be there to help them out. And then you have a focus area that can vary based upon our code metrics, or a given feature that they cared about, or a given project release. And we can also run code analytics. So this is an important component. The same way you would with development code, you want to run a code analysis tool against your automation. For ours, we use QSniffer and Ruby Critic to run against it to see, are there any code smells that they can find? This will help drive us in our refactoring sessions, and will also provide valuable data to the stakeholders to show that yes, as our test suite is getting larger, we are still maintaining the same quality standards, both in terms of the execution passing, but also in terms of extensibility. So, and lastly, our sample improvement list that we pull from our code analytics will help drive us for activity. So in case you have any downtime in the space of the environment is down, the developers aren't ready to deliver this yet, you generate a weekly improvement list, a top 10, so to speak, of things that you can improve within your automation suite. And you can take this list, give it to the members of the team, and have them try to address the top one or the bottom one to try to eliminate it entirely. In this way, we help drive quality long-term. By making these meetings regular, we ensure that the teams care about their entire application health and invest in their automation for the future. So with that, I know I'm out of time on here, so I'll open up to any questions, and I won't keep people from lunch.
Isn't this sample improvement list to me looks kind of like a linter? Couldn't I just use a linter to use the same thing you're doing here?
Yeah, you could. It just, regardless of which approach that you take. For us, it's an automatic improvement list generated as part of Q Sniffer.
Oh, okay.
And so, yeah, so for us, it's a report that's generated the same way an execution report would be generated, where it not only shows the improvement list, but also shows you where those issues are occurring within your suite, so people can just dive in and fix it immediately.
I have a very specific question about Buildbit. Whether
You can't rely on them. So we reduced our automation scripts because why would we put in scripts that are just going to fail for them? And we took a risk-based approach of we'll have manual testing around this for every single release, but we're not going to make it a focus because otherwise we're just going to keep on running into that same wall again and again. So I recommend anytime you have those issues, if the vendors can't give you control, peel it back. Don't have automation around that because you're just going to have automation that fails. Instead, have it be focused on manual. Thank you very much for attending. If you are interested in this deck, especially the in components, I've got a lot of additional information. Please come up and see me. We'll exchange information. Thank you.